Let your body find its most comfortable position. Feel the weight of your shoulders gradually letting go, and the softness of the pillow supporting the back of your neck. Now, close your eyes and let your breath flow naturally, like the rhythm of subterranean waves. We will together leave behind the noise of the modern world to embark on a journey through time and space, returning to a distant Russia of the 19th century. Imagine a thin mist covering your mind, and as that mist clears, you find yourself standing on a narrow cobblestone road in Moscow, an old city full of ups and downs in the year 1821. The surrounding air carries the characteristic biting cold of the northern autumn, mixed with the smell of coal smoke from the chimneys of wooden houses and the scent of damp earth after a drizzle. Less than 2 miles north of the Kremlin center, where the gilded domes still glisten in the fading twilight, is the area of the Mariinsky Hospital for the Poor. This is a quiet suburb where the pace of life seems to slow down and the breath of misery blends into the solemnity of faith. You hear the sound of church bells echoing from afar, steady and deep, like an invitation to step into a world of deep memories. Welcome to Mind Manor, where we will together explore the life of one of the greatest souls in human history through the work of Dostoyevski's biography, For Sleep. Before we begin to step into the first pages of Fyodor's life, if you find yourself loving this journey, please take a second to press the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to leave a comment about the time and place where you are listening to this story. Perhaps 3 a.m. in a small room in Hanoi, or a cold, rainy night in Dalat. I always read all of those messages so that kindred spirits can find each other amidst the vast night, and so I know where your night begins. Now, let all the worries of the long day vanish into the darkness, leaving only my voice and the warmth of historical stories leading you deeper into the bliss of sleep. The road ahead is appearing under the faint yellow lamplight, bringing you to the gate of the hospital where a genius is about to cry his first greeting to the world. Let us begin this journey very slowly and peacefully. The bells from the Kremlin cathedrals echo through the gray expanse of a late autumn afternoon in 1821, blending into the biting cold of a Moscow preparing for the first snows of the season. You were born not in a grand palace, nor in the radiant warmth of the distant nobility, but in a small, cramped apartment, smelling of antiseptics and poverty at the Mariinsky Hospital for the Poor. You are Fyodor Mikhailovich Dostoyevski, and your first breath carried the flavor of suffering and compassion from the lower end of the Russian social scale. The flickering light from the candles in the small room casts shadows upon the wall, where your father, Dr. Mikhail Andreevich, stands with a stern face and eyes filled with worry. He is a man of discipline, a former military doctor carrying the blood of minor nobility, but whose life is clouded by alcoholism and the authoritarianism of one who feels the world is against him. His heavy footsteps echo on the wooden floor, each step like a dry decree, forcing everything around him into the steel framework he has built. In that stifling atmosphere, the presence of your mother, Maria Fyodorovna, is like a soft silk ribbon, soothing the sharp cuts of reality. She is a merchant's daughter, carrying a heart full of the light of Orthodox faith and the pure joy of stories told to children. You feel the stark contrast from the time you are in your cradle, between the darkness of imposition and discipline on one side, and the brilliant light of love and unconditional devotion on the other. This tension is not just a family background. It is the first seed sown in your soul of the deepest inner contradictions, where great characters would later be born from the schism between reason and the heart. Your childhood passes within the hospital grounds, where the boundary between life and death is as thin as a breath in the frost. Your playground is not neatly trimmed flower gardens, but long, echoing corridors where the groans of the sick and the stench of destitution are always present. You stand by the window, watching the gaunt, ragged figures walking in the yard below. They are forgotten lives, miserable souls seeking Marinsky as the final stop of their fate. For you, poverty is not an abstract concept from books, but gaunt faces, pleading eyes, and trembling hands gripping the edges of hospital beds. Those images are etched into your mind, creating a thick layer of empathy, ensuring you can never look at the world without seeing the pain hidden behind the glamorous facade. When you were 9 years old, a painful memory permanently changed how you perceived humanity. When a 9-year-old girl had been raped by a drunk, he was asked to fetch his father to attend to her. You ran to find your father in panic, and the image of that poor girl, the breaking of an innocent soul before meaningless cruelty, became a scar that would never heal in your spirit. It sowed the painful question of the nature of evil and human fragility in your heart, a theme you would spend your entire life dissecting in every page you wrote. You realize that this world is a giant hospital where every soul is bleeding and needs to be healed by something greater than mere medicine. In the darkness of that misery, literature and faith appeared as beacons guiding your young soul. From the age of 3, you immersed yourself in the world of heroic sagas, fairy tales, and legends through the rhythmic storytelling of your nanny, Elena Frolovna. Those stories were not just entertainment. They were your first moral lessons, where good and evil battled in a mystical, spiritual space. At age 4, your mother began teaching you to read and write, and the first words you touched were not the common alphabet, but the sacred words from the Book of Job, which made a stunningly strong impression on you for life. The story of the righteous man, stripped of everything yet maintaining his faith in God, caused a powerful spiritual shock within you, laying the foundation for reflections on justice, endurance, and salvation. Every evening, under the flickering oil lamp, your family gathered to read together, where your father's voice rose with the historical works of Karamzin or Homer's epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey. You were led through the emotional mazes of Alexander Pushkin, the alluring dread of Gothic novels by Anne Radcliffe, and the high romantic ideals of Friedrich Schiller or Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. Your imagination was brought alive by nightly readings by your parents, soaring beyond the gray walls of the hospital to distant horizons where humans struggle with fate and impossible desires. Those evenings were rare moments when family tension gave way to spiritual harmony, where you learned to love the people on the pages more than the people you met in real life. The major turning point came in 1831, when your father purchased the small estate of Darovoy in the Tula province, opening a new chapter filled with sun and wind in your life. Away from the stifling air of Moscow, you breathed the fresh air of the Russian countryside, where wheat fields stretched to the horizon and deep green birch forests hid many mysteries. Here, for the first time, you came into contact with the vast peasant population up close, hard-working people who carried a pure spiritual beauty. You remember vividly one afternoon, while playing in the forest and suddenly shivering at the imagined howl of a wolf, you fled in fear toward a peasant plowing the field named Mary. Instead of mocking the cowardice of a young master, Mary stopped his work, used his thick, soil-covered hands to gently stroke your cheek and comforted you with a strangely warm voice. That tenderness, the compassion from a person considered the lowest in society, left a profound mark, forming your firm belief in the Russian peasant's inherent spiritual depth. You realized that salvation for Russia did not lie in dry theories from the West, but in the simple hearts and deep Orthodox faith of these working people. Turovoy was not just a summer retreat. It was a practical school teaching you about the soul of the nation, about the invisible bond between land and people, which would later become the backbone of your greatest political and philosophical thoughts. However, that freedom did not last forever, as your father began directing you toward a more formal and rigorous education to prepare for the future. You were sent to boarding schools, where life became cold and disciplined, completely detached from the dream world you cherished. At the Chermak boarding school in Moscow, you felt out of place among your aristocratic classmates. You saw the vanity and arrogance of those with money, and the difference in social status made you retreat further into the shell of a pale, introverted dreamer and an overexcitable romantic. Instead of participating in loud games or idle gossip, you chose to escape into the library, immersing yourself in the world of Nikolai Gogol, where reality and the grotesque intertwined. These school years deepened the sense of social alienation, making you more sensitive to every inner fluctuation. You began to feel the weight of expectation from your father, the financial sacrifice he endured to educate you, and the fear of an uncertain future ahead. These experiences of loneliness and the feeling of being discarded were the most realistic materials for you to build the image of the underground man, later on, a wounded soul always seeking to rebel against the world. Through contempt and self-torment, the spring of 1837 brought a storm of tragedy that completely ended your childhood, beginning with the death of your beloved mother from tuberculosis. As she took her last breath, you felt as if the only warm source of light in the house had gone out, leaving a vast void that nothing could fill. Only months later, the news of Alexander Pushkin's death in a duel struck a fatal blow to your soul. For he was not just a poet, he was the idol, the soul, and the pride of an entire generation of Russians like you. The world around you collapsed, the family scattered, and your father decided to send the two brothers to St. Petersburg to take the entrance exam for the Military Engineering Institute, a practical but dry path. You stand on the threshold of the past, looking back at the hospital home and the forests of Daravoy for the last time, clearly feeling that you are stepping into a stormy era. The cold wind from the north blows in, carrying the moisture of the distant Neva River, urging you to set foot on a journey from which there is no turning back. You step onto the carriage waiting at the gate, feeling the gentle rocking as the wooden wheels begin to roll on the narrow stone road. The shadows of the late afternoon are gradually falling over the old houses of Moscow, blurring the memories of a childhood both painful and glorious. The sound of horse hooves beating steadily on the road is like the heartbeat of a new chapter unfolding, taking you further away from the place that molded your soul. The biting wind of the Russian plains lashes directly at your face as the jolting carriage moves northward, leaving behind the last warm light of your home in Moscow. You sit there, hands tightly clasped in your thin coat, clearly feeling the rupture of a reality you once believed was eternal. The year 1837 appears in your mind, not in numbers, but in the smell of funeral flowers mixed with the musty odor of hospital rooms. Your mother, Maria Fyodorovna, passed away on a gray February day when the last snow of the season still clung to the window frames. That cruel tuberculosis drained the life from her gentle body, leaving a vast void that no amount of your father's iron discipline could fill. You recall your mother's face, pale and serene, a stark contrast to the increasing paranoia of your doctor father. She was your harbor, the one who taught you to love ancient prayers and romantic poems. And when she was laid to rest, you felt as if the most benevolent part of your world had also been buried beneath the cold earth. This departure was not just a family loss. It was the collapse of a moral order, pushing you into a space of displacement and deep psychological disturbances you were never ready to face. That personal pain seemed insufficient when all of Russia was shaken by thunderous news. Alexander Pushkin had fallen in a duel in St. Petersburg. For a 15-year-old youth who worshipped literature as a religion, Pushkin's death was like the sun suddenly going dark at midday. You felt a strange connection between your family's grief and the nation's grief, a double mourning weighing heavily on your small shoulders. If we did not have family mourning, I would ask permission to wear mourning for Pushkin. Your greatest idol had departed at the age of 37, leaving behind a literature that was now orphaned, and you realized the devastating fragility of beauty before the gun barrel of destiny. His poems still echoed in your head, but now they carried a more mournful tone, like echoes from a lost world. This event sowed in your heart the first awareness of the unpredictable nature of fate, where even the greatest souls can be destroyed by the most tyrannical accidents. The journey to St. Petersburg was not just a trip to school, but an exile into emotional isolation when your father decided to send the two brothers to the Mykolaiv Military Engineering Institute. You saw the capital, St. Petersburg, emerge in the mist, a city of cold stone, luxury mansions, and dark canals, completely different from the ancient and familiar Moscow. Tragedy continued to surround you when your older brother, Mikhail, your only soulmate, was rejected for health reasons and had to move to Reval. You stood alone in the vast military schoolyard, feeling like a fragment cast into a heartless, giant machine. This school was the embodiment of everything you loathed: iron discipline, blind obedience, and the dry numbers of military engineering. For a soul yearning only for painting, architecture, and poetry, every hour of mathematics or military science was a woeful mistake and one long torture. You felt your artistic nature being suffocated under the weight of strict regulations and the tyranny of training officers. You walked the corridors of the academy, feeling completely out of place among your 120 classmates, young aristocratic masters who always carried an air of confidence and graceful poise. While they engaged in parties or frivolous games, you retreated into a corner with a uniform that looked odd and clumsy. Your classmate Konstantin Trutovsky was not wrong when he described you as the one with the least military bearing. There was no student in the entire institution with less of a military bearing than F.M. Dostoyevski. He moved clumsily and jerkily. His uniform hung awkwardly on him, and his knapsack, sack, and rifle all looked like some sort of fetter he had been forced to wear. You moved jerkily, your face pale from lack of sleep, but your eyes burned with an internal fire that few understood. Despite being considered an eccentric, you earned silent respect through your courage in protecting new students from the corruption of officers. The nickname Monk Photius, given to you by friends, was both a mockery and an acknowledgement of the religious depth and voluntary solitude you chose to survive in this harsh environment. Your only sanctuary was the world of book pages, where the flickering candlelight in the dark night became your most loyal companion. You immersed yourself in the works of Shakespeare, Schiller, Balzac, and Victor Hugo, seeking answers within them for the pain gnawing at your soul. Especially Nikolai Gogol, with his stories of small people in a giant city, opened a new vision of Russian reality for you. Those sleepless nights spent reading not only helped you forget the exhaustion of daytime training, but were also the moments you began constructing the complex psychological mazes for your later characters. You felt the pulse of great ideas flowing through your veins, a spiritual power quietly growing in the darkness of the military academy. Literature was no longer entertainment. It was a life and death dialogue between you and destiny, the only way for you to maintain your ego before being crushed by military rigidity. But the biggest shadow was still waiting ahead when news from the Daravoy estate arrived in June 1839. Your father, Dr. Mikhail Andreevich, who had retreated into solitude and alcoholism after your mother's death, had suddenly passed away. The official cause was recorded as an apoplectic stroke, but whispers from home told a much more horrific story. It was said that he had been murdered by his own serfs by strangulation, a revenge for years of being ruled by tyranny and cruelty. Although the serfs were later acquitted, the suspicion of a parricide clung to their minds like a parasite. You were only 18, and now you were officially an orphan. But the heaviest burden was not loneliness, but a sense of unconscious guilt. Perhaps, in moments of being oppressed by him, you had once wished he would disappear, and when it actually happened in the most brutal way, it created a psychological scar that would never heal. Many later believed that the shock from your father's death was the seed that triggered your epilepsy, the disease of the gods that you would carry for the rest of your life. The feeling of guilt and the obsession over whether a human has the right to take the life of a tyrant became a black hole in your soul. You almost never wrote about your father's death directly, but the breath of that parricide would exhale into every chapter of the Brothers Karamazov 40 years later. You realized that evil and punishment lie not only in the law, but in the painful judgment of conscience. Each subsequent seizure of the disease would be a reminder of the fragile boundary between life and death, between victim and perpetrator. You stood before the abyss of existence, clearly feeling that every human action carries a terrible moral weight, and no one can escape their own judgment. After your father's death, you received a small inheritance, enough to begin an independent life in St. Petersburg after being promoted to an engineering cadet. The escape from the military dormitory gave you a false sense of freedom, where you began to indulge in the pleasures of the capital. You went to the theater, listened to opera, and immersed yourself in concerts with your brother, Mikhail, whenever he visited. But within this freedom, another demon awakened in you, the passion for gambling. Through new friends, you entered brightly lit casinos, where every hand was a stake on both future and honor. The allowance of 5,000 rubles per year from your guardian, a significant sum, seemed to evaporate in an instant. You spent lavishly, treating friends to extravagant dinners, only to later go hungry or lose as much as 1,000 rubles at a billiard table in a single evening. Destitution clung to you like a ghost, forcing you to seek out usurers with exorbitant interest rates, creating an inescapable spiral of debt. In August 1843, you officially graduated from the academy with the rank of second lieutenant, beginning your service in the engineering corps in St. Petersburg. You lived with a friend of your brother, Dr. Risenkampf, who saw behind your elegant exterior an easily excitable and volatile soul. There were times you were good-natured and polite, But there were also times when a bad mood made you see everything through dark glasses. No less good-natured and no less courteous than his brother. But when not in a good mood, he often looked at everything through dark glasses, became vexed, forgot good manners, and sometimes was carried away to the point of abusiveness and loss of self-awareness. You realized that a career in technical military service with dry blueprints was absolutely not for you. Your true passion was burning in manuscripts, where you began your first literary project, translating Honoré de Balzac's novel Eugénie Grandet into Russian. When the translation was published in the summer of 1843, you felt a surge of electricity through your veins, a feeling of happiness never experienced before, upon seeing your name associated with the professional literary world. Although this translation work did not bring wealth, and even pushed you deeper into debt due to overspending, it confirmed one thing: you were born to write. During those white nights, sitting at the wooden table, the scratching of the nib on paper, blending with the wind whistling through the cracks of your St. Petersburg apartment, you knew you could no longer wear the mask of an officer. The fire of creative passion had ignited a determination, urging you to cast off the military shell to fully commit to a path full of uncertainty, but also full of glory. You stand up from your desk, slowly buttoning the uniform that has begun to feel cramped and uncomfortable. The sound of leather boots pounding on the wooden floor echoes steadily as you walk toward the window, looking down at the St. Petersburg street, sinking into the damp night mist. You take a deep breath, sensing the smell of ink and dust in the small room, then decisively push the door open to step out into the dark hallway, where the echoes of literary dreams are calling you deeper into the heart of the city. You stand before the mirror, hands trembling as you slowly unbutton each brass button on your lieutenant's uniform, feeling as if you are removing a layer of shackles that has bound your soul for many long years. The smell of coarse wool and dry technical blueprints seems to have seeped into your flesh, but now you decide to cast it all off, to choose a path with nothing but uncertainty and white pages. In the spring of 1844, at age 23, your decision to resign from the military was not just a gamble, but a spiritual liberation. You gave up a stable income and a secure social status that your late father had always wished for, only to trade it for the right to write, to breathe, and to live in the world of Shakespeare, Schiller, and Balzac. You moved to a dilapidated apartment on the outskirts of St. Petersburg, where damp walls and the cold crept through every strand of hair each night. Your life now consisted of only dry bread, weak cups of tea, and the darkness of destitution, but your heart burned with a fire more intense than ever. You plunged into writing with a frenzied intensity, often staying up all night under the flickering candlelight, feeling every pulse of the small, invisible people taking shape on the manuscript pages. You wanted to write about them, the poor clerks, the seamstresses, the souls crushed by the bureaucratic system, to prove that behind those ragged appearances was an inner world as rich and worthy of respect as that of the nobility. In a narrow room just large enough for a table and a small bed, you wove Time's Poor Folk, the epistolary novel containing all your pain and empathy. You transformed into Makar Devushkin, a poor old clerk, conveying tender words and his last shreds of self-respect through letters to Varvara, a girl equally destitute. In March 1845, as the ink dried on the final lines, you gave the manuscript to Dmitri Grigorovich with a mixture of hope and utter fear. And then a historic white night took place. when St. Petersburg did not sleep, and the shimmering northern light enveloped the city like a dream, the white, bright as day Petersburg night. A frantic knock on the door at 4 a.m. startled you awake, only to find Grigorovich and the poet Nikolai Nekrasov standing there with eyes red from emotion. They had read your manuscript all night, unable to look away for even a minute, and they embraced you in pure admiration. The very next morning, Nekrasov took your work to Vissarion Belinsky, the most powerful critic in Russia, loudly proclaiming, "A new Gogol has appeared." The moment you stood before Belinsky, in his study filled with books and light, your heart felt like it would leap out of your chest as you heard him exclaim in amazement, "Do you yourself understand what you have written?" Belinsky had seen a brutal and humane truth in your work. He praised it as Russia's first social novel. Overnight, from an anonymous figure living in hunger, you became the center of the capital's literary world, your name echoing through the most elegant salons. Glory came so fast and so brilliantly that your soul began to crack with vanity and arrogance. You began to lecture on art, comparing yourself to the giants, and unintentionally created an alienating distance from the very people who had supported you. This psychological degradation was a subtle poison, making you fail to realize that the illusory aura of fame could fade as quickly as it began, leaving behind a loneliness deeper than poverty. The collapse came almost immediately when you published Times, The Double Times, in early 1846, a work delving into the darkness of madness and split personality. You led readers into the mind of Yakov Golyadkin, a minor clerk obsessed with a copy of himself, one more cunning, successful, and confident. You used internal monologue to peel back the layers of fear and repressed ambition within the character's heart. But instead of acclaim, you received harsh criticism and mockery from critics, including Belinsky. They did not understand the innovation in your description of the stream of consciousness. They deemed your work long-winded, repetitive, and far from the social reform goals of realism. Your literary status plummeted, salon doors slammed in your face, and you were once again pushed back into the shadows of isolation and debt. You wrote frantically to survive, from Times, Mr. Prokharkin Times to Times White Nights, but the cold public response exhausted your spirit. It was during these dark days that the seizures of epilepsy began to appear with greater frequency, like a resistance of the body against the overwhelming psychological pressures you were enduring. Shunned by the literary world, you found solace in Friday evenings at Mikhail Petrushevsky's apartment from the spring of 1847. In the thick tobacco smoke and dim yellow lamplight, you and other young intellectuals discussed French utopian socialism and dreams of a fairer Russia. You listened to the ideas of Fourier and Proudhon about liberating the serfs and abolishing autocracy, but in your heart, you always felt a violent tug of war. On one side was the humanitarian ideal of helping the wretched. On the other was the deep orthodox faith that always valued spiritual salvation over material change. You did not entirely agree with the atheistic materialism of many group members, creating a silent inner battle between Christian humanism and the alien radical ideas that were gradually taking hold of your reason. Your involvement became even more dangerous when you joined the secret society of Nikolai Speshnev, a nobleman with a charismatic exterior but hidden violent revolutionary ambitions. Here, discussions no longer stopped at theory but moved to underground tactics, even a plan to set up a clandestine printing press to distribute forbidden materials. Although you claimed you were not a true revolutionary, The indignation at the injustice of serfdom pushed you into risky actions. You sensed the smell of danger lingering in the air, but like a moth drawn to the light of justice, you could not stop. You were walking on a thin wire stretched across the abyss of rebellion, where every step could lead to total destruction. The climax of recklessness occurred at a meeting of the Petrushevsky Circle in 1848, when you stood up and read aloud Belinsky's forbidden letter to Gogol. Each sharp word attacking the church and the Tsar rang out in the silent room like hammers striking the foundation of the autocratic empire. You read with a strange passion, unaware that among those listening, a police spy named Antonelli was quietly recording your every word and gesture to report to Tsar Nicholas I. As all of Europe teetered from the 1,848 revolutions, your action was considered an inexcusable betrayal. The ghost of the secret police was haunting the city, and your days of creative freedom were slowly closing under the intense surveillance of the government. You felt a cold current run down your spine, a premonition of a horrific tragedy waiting to swallow you into the frozen heart of Siberia. You put the letter down on the table, breath still heavy after the fiery words, and slowly walked out onto the balcony to look down at the Neva River flowing lazily in the darkness of the Petersburg night. The cold wind tossed your hair, carrying the smell of damp river water and the distant echo of patrol wheels rolling steadily on the streets. You took a deep breath of the last bit of free air, feeling the terrifying stillness of the city before the storm hit, then decisively turned back into the room, where unfinished manuscripts still lay waiting under the dying candlelight. You knew you could not escape what you had chosen, and now, all you could do was wait for the fateful knock of destiny. The knocking on the door tore through the quiet St. Petersburg night at 4 o'clock in the morning on the 23rd of April, 1849, a dry, cold sound signaling the end of dreams of freedom. You bolted upright in the darkness, heart pounding as the shadows of the secret police swarmed the apartment, carrying the chill of the Neva River and the scent of autocratic power. Unfinished manuscript pages, letters exchanged regarding socialist ideals, and even Belinsky's forbidden letter that you had once read so passionately have now become undeniable evidence against you. You were escorted through the silent streets of the capital, where the early morning mist covered the mansions like a shroud, before the iron gates of the Peter and Paul fortress slammed shut behind you. This was the home of forgotten souls, the most notorious prison of the Russian Empire, where every stone was steeped in the chill of captivity. You were pushed into the Alexeyevsky Ravelin, a cramped, isolated cell where light was but a faint blur through a narrow slit, and the silence was so thick you could hear the blood flowing in your veins. For 8 long months, you lived in a state of suspension between reality and illusion, completely cut off from the outside world, without books, without ink or paper, only the 4 damp stone walls for company. In that absolute solitude, instead of collapsing, your mind began an extraordinary expansion, where memories of childhood in Moscow and the Daravoy estates returned more vividly than ever. You began to compose stories right in your head, molding characters and dialogues in the darkness, turning the cell into a vast internal universe where your soul sought escape from the shackles of reality. The morning of the 22nd of December 1849 arrived with the bone-chilling cold of the Russian winter, as you and your comrades from the Petrushevsky group were taken to Semyonov Place under strict military supervision. White snow covered the ground, reflecting the pale light of the early morning sun, creating a strangely quiet and macabre scene. You saw a wooden scaffold already erected in the center of the square, dark stakes rising from the thick snow, and the execution squad waiting with rifles in hand. The death sentence was read in a soulless voice, echoing through the empty space. Treason, spreading dangerous ideas, the penalty of death. You were forced to wear a long white shirt meant for those about to die. A hood was ready to hide the world from your eyes. As you were placed in the second group preparing for the execution grounds, the feeling of impending death was no longer a vague fear, but an existing reality as sharp as a blade. In that moment, time seemed to stand still, and your mind reached a strange clarity, a state of awakening you had never experienced in your entire life. You calculated that you had exactly 5 minutes to live, and you decided to divide that small amount of time meticulously to enjoy the final breaths of existence. The first 2 minutes were spent saying goodbye to the brothers standing beside you, firm handshakes, and exchanged gazes taking the place of 1,000 words. The next 2 minutes were for you to think about yourself, about all you had done and what you regretted, a quick summary of a human life about to close. And the final minute, you devoted entirely to looking at the surrounding world once more, to record the beauty of reality deep in your soul before everything became nothingness. There was a church not far off, its gilt roof shining in the bright sunshine. He could not tear his eyes from those rays of light. Those rays seemed to him to be his new nature, and he felt that in 3 minutes he would somehow fuse with them. An intense desire to live rose within you, a painful regret for the moments wasted in the past. You told yourself that what if I didn't have to die? What if I could get my life back? What an infinity it would be, and it would all be mine. Then I would make each minute into a lifetime. I would lose nothing, and would account for each minute, waste nothing in vain. The rapid drum beats began to sound, signaling that the final moment had struck. The soldiers raised their guns and aimed directly at the hearts of those in the first row. You closed your eyes, preparing to receive the cold of the bullet piercing your chest. But instead of an explosion, the sound of galloping horse hooves rang out across the square. An officer rode up, carrying a decree from the Tsar. The death sentence was pardoned and commuted to hard labor in Siberia. The entire execution ritual thus far was actually a calculated cruelty designed to break the condemned. The shock was too great for Nikolai Grigoriev, standing beside you, who lost his mind on the spot. But for you, this was a resurrection. You stepped down from the scaffold with a different soul, a person who had seen death and been returned to life, carrying a permanent spiritual scar that would shape every word you wrote thereafter. On Christmas night in 1849, while the entire city was immersed in the warmth of family parties, you were taken from the fortress to begin the journey of exile to Siberia. Brutal guards wrapped 1 0-pound irons around your legs. The cold iron rings cut directly into your flesh, creating wounds that would accompany you for the next 4 years. You were pushed onto an open sleigh, facing the vast darkness and bone-chilling cold of the Russian steppe. The wind shrieked past your ears like the screams of demons, and the snow fell so thick you could no longer distinguish earth from sky. The journey lasted many weeks across frozen rivers, where your breath turned instantly to frost on your thick beard. Each time the sleigh jolted, the sound of the iron chains clashing against each other reminded you of your new status, a sinner. A number in the empire's vast labor system. After 14 days and nights of traveling in exhaustion, you stopped at the Tobolsk transit station, where a fateful meeting awaited. Noblewomen, wives of the Decembrists from the previous generation, had secretly sought to comfort and supply the prisoners. They gave you a small New Testament, within which was hidden a 10-ruble note as a silent support. That book was your only lifeline, because in the Siberian prison, it was the only book allowed in prison. You held the scripture close to your heart, feeling a strange warmth spread a faint spiritual light amidst the cold night of the land of exile. On the 23rd of January 1850, you set foot in the Omsk labor camp, an ancient fortress surrounded by sharp wooden stakes. Considered the House of the Dead, you were pushed into a cramped barrack where hundreds of prisoners were locked in a space meant for only half that number. You immediately felt the stifling air thick with the smell of sweat, stench, and bodies that had not bathed for months. In summer, intolerable closeness. In winter, unendurable cold. All the floors were rotten, filth on the floors an inch thick. One could slip and fall. We were packed like herrings in a barrel. There was no room to turn around. From dusk to dawn, it was impossible not to behave like pigs, fleas, lice, and black beetles by the bushel. You were classified in the most dangerous prisoner group and had to endure strict supervision with shackles on your hands and feet day and night. Daily work consisted of a series of physical torments in -40° cold. You had to carry heavy bricks, shovel snow piles taller than a person, or use a hammer to crush stiff slabs of gypsum. The white gypsum dust flew everywhere, clinging to your lungs with every rapid breath, making you feel as if your chest was being destroyed from within. But that physical pain was nothing compared to the total deprivation of privacy, as you were never alone for a single minute for 4 years. You felt like a man buried alive and awakening in his coffin, frantically beating on the lid, desperate for air. It was in that hell on earth that your epilepsy flared up more intensely than ever as a nervous system reaction to the overwhelming pressure. Seizures came unexpectedly, throwing you into a dark void and leaving you with long days submerged in the fog of confusion and exhausting depression. You lay on a filthy bunk bed, watching lice crawl on the walls, and felt the fragility of your mind. However, it was also at Omsk that you underwent a revolution in your understanding of humanity that no philosophy book could teach. You were forced to live with thieves, cold-blooded murderers, and the most brutal criminals of society. Instead of revulsion, you began to observe them through the eyes of a writer, and you were shocked to realize that the idealized theories about the people held by the St. People, Petersburg intelligentsia, were completely detached from reality. Humans are not machines that can be programmed with perfect social systems. They are complex, contradictory, and instinctual beings. You saw that even in the lowest of people, moments of compassion, distinct rules of honor, and an immeasurable spiritual depth still existed. The collapse of utopian socialism within you gave way to a new belief that salvation does not lie in reforming society from the outside, but in the transformation of the soul from within. You realized the desire for individual freedom is something that cannot be extinguished, and faith is the final anchor to prevent humans from becoming beasts in the face of misery. The New Testament given to you by the women in Tobolsk now became your only companion, the lamp illuminating your soul through long nights of despair. You read and reread the biblical pages under the dim yellow lamplight of the barracks, seeking solace in the figure of Christ, the one who suffered and was crucified for humanity. To you, Christ was no longer a distant theological concept. but a supreme moral ideal, the embodiment of unconditional love and selfless sacrifice. In a letter written in early 1854, you confessed that you were a child of unbelief and doubt up to this moment, and I am certain that I shall remain so to the grave. However, you also made a shocking declaration, asserting that even if someone were to prove to me that the truth lay outside Christ, I should choose to remain with Christ rather than with the truth. This belief was not blind infatuation, but the result of a journey through hell where you realized that only love and forgiveness could heal the wounds of the human soul. You died as a naive intellectual, full of theories borrowed from the West, only to be reborn at Omsk as a writer carrying the deepest vision of the light and darkness of human nature. On the 15th of February 1854, after 4 long years, your term of hard labor finally ended as the iron chains were removed from your ankles. You stood before the fortress gates, taking a deep breath of the cold Siberian air, feeling a strange relief as the iron rings no longer cut into your skin. But freedom was still a distant thing, as you were ordered to move to Semipalatinsk to perform mandatory military service as a private. You were no longer the slender young man of 1849, but a seasoned man with eyes containing the secrets of the realm of death. You looked back at the wooden walls of the Omsk camp one last time, the place that had taken your youth but returned to you a great soul, then quietly followed the escort of soldiers. You walked on the dirt road covered with the melting snow of spring, feeling the vibration of the ground beneath your feet that was no longer restrained by shackles. Your steps were still heavy from the habit of wearing chains for many years, but each step forward carried a new determination for life and creativity. Your shadow stretched on the trail as the sun set behind distant mountains, taking you toward a new military barrack where other trials of fate were waiting to be conquered. The steady beat of leather boots on the parched earth of the Kazakh steppe replaces the clanking of iron chains, yet their rhythm still carries a vague weight of compulsion. You enter the town of Semipalatinsk, amidst the scorching sun and wind-blown dust of the borderlands, where low wooden houses and military garrisons appear as a hyphen between Russian civilization and the endless immensity of the Asian steppe. On the 15th of February, 1854, when the 10-pound iron rings were finally removed from your ankles, you did not feel a burst of joy, but rather a strange emptiness. You were issued a new uniform, the rank of private in the 7th Line Battalion, and a small room in a wooden settlement instead of the filthy bunks at Omsk. There was a salary. There was relative privacy. But this release was actually another form of exile, more subtle and requiring even greater patience. Semipalatinsk was a prison without bars, where the repetitive routines of military life, from parades under the blistering sun to long night watches, gradually gnawed at your soul with maddening monotony. For an intellectual carrying the vibrant blood of St. Petersburg, and a mind tempered through the hell of hard labor, this stillness was sometimes more terrifying than the shouts of a prison warden. You found yourself standing in a desolate land where time seemed to stand still in the dust, and all your literary aspirations had to find a way to slip through the cracks of military discipline to find a path back to life. You began new white nights, not for writing, but for reading, to reconnect the threads of communication with the intellectual world that had been severed for 10 long years. In desperate letters sent back to your brother Mikhail, you pleaded for support not just financially, but spiritually, requesting the works of Hegel, Kant, or the historical studies of Guizot and Ranke. Under the flickering oil lamp in the wooden chamber, You buried your head in the pages like a starving man clutching bread, feeling the vibrations of great philosophical thoughts flowing back into your veins. You did not read merely for knowledge, but to rediscover your ego, to confirm that the Fyodor Dostoyevski of the golden years still existed behind the coarse coat of a private. This restoration of intellectual life took place in silence, amidst the snoring of roommates and the smell of damp leather, creating a profound contrast between the primitive military environment and the sophisticated world of abstract thought you were gradually rebuilding. You realized that even though your body was imprisoned at the edge of the empire, your soul had begun to cross the borders of the steppe to return to the great debates of humanity. Your solitude at Semipalatinsk began to be warmed by rare friendships, including the arrival of Baron Alexander Igorovich Wrangel in November 1854. Wrangel was not only an admirer of your literature, but also someone who had witnessed the moment you stood before the gun barrels at Semyonovsky Square, a bond of destiny that no words could fully describe. When the two of you rented houses together in the peaceful Cossack garden, Wrangel looked deep into your face and saw all the marks of devastation that Omsk had left behind. You appeared to him as one who looked morose. His sickly, pale face was covered with freckles, and his blonde hair was cut short. However, it was your sharp blue-gray eyes that made others hesitant, for they always stared as if trying to pierce through the outer shell to discover the very end of their soul. It was as if he were trying to look into my soul and discover what kind of man I was. Meeting intellectuals like Wrangel or the geographer Pyotr Semyonov helped you regain your confidence, making you feel like a part of the elite community once more, despite your status as an exiled soldier. You spent afternoons walking with Wrangel, discussing dreams and pains, while your religious life unfolded in the stillness of pilgrimages and moments spent gazing at the vast starry sky of the steppe. You no longer favored flamboyant church rituals or dry Siberian priests, but whenever Christ was mentioned, your voice burned with an infinite fervor, as if he were the only friend who truly understood your asceticism. However, the shadow of epilepsy still followed you like a curse, erupting with more terrifying intensity than ever during this period. You began to sense the onset of seizures through a strange state of ecstasy, a brilliant aura that you described as perfect harmony with the universe, where the meaning of existence became so clear it was almost tangible. But immediately after that peak of sublime elevation came the collapse of consciousness, violent convulsions that threw your body onto the filthy floor, followed by long hours submerged in the fog of confusion and total exhaustion. You would wake with a shattered body and a hollow mind, struggling to remember even the simplest words, feeling your life force being drained after each episode. The disease was not just physical pain, it was a reminder of the fragile boundary between heaven and hell within the human brain, an experience you would later transform into material for characters like Prince Mishkin. You lived in constant fear of the next storm, yet simultaneously yearned for that brief moment of ecstasy before the darkness fell, a struggle that only souls who have passed through death can understand. It was during these gray days of military service that the encounter with Maria Dmitrievna Isayeva threw you into the most intense and stormy emotional whirlwind of your life. Maria, a woman of French descent with a complex and paranoid personality, attracted you not with radiant beauty, but with a shared sense of pain and hypersensitivity. You quickly fell in love with the wife of Alexander Isayev, a love colored by adoration and salvation, even though you knew well it was a path leading to the abyss. When Alexander passed away in 1855, you immediately proposed to Maria. but her hesitation deepened the wounds in your heart. She saw in you the bleak future of a poor soldier with a terrifying disease, and the appearance of a rival, the young, healthy teacher Verganov, turned your love into a battle of frantic jealousy. You fell into a state of severe depression, writing tearful and pathetic letters, even threatening suicide, and borrowing sums you could not repay just to buy her gifts. This torment, the obsession with betrayal, LA, and the desire for possession became a vivid psychological experiment, helping you understand the self-destructive impulses of humans that would later be present in every page of your writing. Finally, in February 1857, the marriage took place in Kuznetsk after your right to marry was restored through Wrangel's intervention with General Totleben. You stood in the church, exchanging rings with Maria with a fragile hope for a family home. But the reality was far more brutal than you had imagined. The marriage of two scarred souls quickly became a series of unhappy days, where Maria's tuberculosis and her suspicious nature constantly clashed with your poverty and illness. You lived in a strange bond where suffering itself seemed to be the only thread tying two lives together. Because of her strange, suspicious, and fantastic character, we were definitely not happy together. But we could not stop loving each other. And the more unhappy we were, the more attached to each other we became. You realize that love does not always bring peace. Sometimes it is another form of mortification that fate reserves for you, a trial of patience and faith amidst the naked realities of exile. Nonetheless, the relative stability of being a family man provided the conditions for your pen to begin moving again after nearly 10 years of silence. The year 1856 marked a significant turning point when you were not only promoted to second lieutenant, but also regained the right to publish books, albeit still under strict police surveillance. You began to write seriously, as if to make up for lost time, and works such as Time's Uncle's Dream Times and Time's The Village of Stepanchikovo Times began to take shape. These novels carried a humorous and satirical tone regarding provincial life, where you sketched the hypocritical character Foma Opiskin as a parody of the erroneous ideas of your own spiritual mentor, Nikolai Gogol. Although these works were not your most outstanding masterpieces and were considered somewhat dated by St. Petersburg critics, to you, they were proof of your artistic existence. You were learning to observe the world through a new lens, the lens of a man who had experienced hell and now viewed life with understanding mixed with a touch of bitter irony. Every word you wrote during this period carried the breath of the borderlands and the flawed small people you had met during your years of exile, preparing for a more spectacular return in the future. The severe decline in health due to consecutive epileptic seizures finally brought you true freedom when doctors confirmed you were no longer fit for military service. In 1859, you were officially discharged and, more importantly, received a pardon from the new Tsar Alexander II, allowing you to leave Siberia and return to the European territory of Russia. You began the journey back along the same path you had traveled 10 years ago in chains, but now you traveled with Maria, your stepson, and Pasha, and a bag full of accumulated manuscripts. The stop at Tver was an emotional reunion with your brother Mikhail, where the two brothers embraced and wept after a long decade of separation and loss. When you stepped back into St. Petersburg, in December 1859, you found yourself in a city that had completely changed, where the idealistic youth of the 1840s had been replaced by cynical, materialistic, and pragmatic intellectuals. But you were no longer the shy young man of the past. You brought back from Siberia a vast treasure of knowledge about the darkness of the human soul and an unshakable spiritual strength. You step off the train, feeling the moisture of the Neva River seeping through your coat and the familiar smell of coal smoke from the St. Petersburg railway station. Dim streetlights cast shadows on the cobblestones where mist is beginning to cover the towering roofs of the capital. You stand still for a moment, letting the city's cold air fill your lungs, then slowly pick up your old luggage bag and decisively walk toward the streets where you once belonged. Your footsteps echo on the stones like a confirmation of your return, taking you deep into the heart of the city that is waiting to witness the greatest rebirth of a genius. The moisture of the Neva River seeps through your wool coat, carrying the smell of coal smoke and the cold breath of a St. Petersburg winter, gradually closing to make way for the spring of 1860. You stand there on the familiar stone bridge, watching the melting ice floes drift lazily under the dark water, clearly sensing the changes in the city after your 10-year absence. 10 years of hard labor and exile in Siberia have left wrinkles of severity on your face, but simultaneously granted you a clairvoyant vision of human nature that no intellectual in this capital possesses. The St. Petersburg you return to is no longer the sanctuary of romantic ideals of the 1840s, where dreaming souls once discussed the salvation of humanity. Now, the city is filled with a new generation of intellectuals, young people with cynical, pragmatic, and cold ideas. They worship materialism and are ready to discard faith to follow dry mathematical formulas. You feel like a ghost from the past returning, carrying the warmth of compassion and the darkness of asceticism, out of place among the neoclassical buildings springing up like mushrooms. However, that alienation does not make you retreat. On the contrary, it urges you to speak out, to rewrite what you saw in the house of the dead, to awaken the souls sleeping in the complacency of reason. You begin days of strenuous work with your brother Mikhail, the only soulmate who always believed in your genius during the darkest years. In the cramped editorial room, reeking of printer's ink and cigarette smoke, the two brothers together gave birth to the magazine Vremya, Time, in 1861. The sound of the printing press, pounding day and night, is like the heartbeat of a new life beginning to beat again. And each manuscript page of Notes from the House of the Dead released is another time you liberate the horrific obsessions from Omsk into the hearts of readers. You tell of murderous criminals carrying moments of holiness, of the brutality of chains, and the strange beauty of endurance, causing the entire Russian literary world to shudder. Even Leo Tolstoy had to bow before your brutal authenticity, and for the first time in years, you taste the flavor of literary glory along with a stable source of income. But that glory does not bring you peace. It is only a brief respite before new storms of life and doubt about Western society begin to strike. In the summer of 1862, you board a transcontinental train to undertake your first journey to the West, carrying an intense curiosity about the civilization that the Russian intelligentsia always revered. You pass through Berlin, Dresden, Paris, and stop in London amidst thick fog and the roar of industrial factories. But instead of finding the paradise of freedom and reason, you witness a horrific scene of exploitation and human alienation within the giant capitalist machine. Standing before the magnificent Crystal Palace at the World Exhibition, you do not see a wonder of progress, but a temple of the false god Baal, where humans are turned into soulless components and the sacrifice is performed with their very dignity and souls. You sense the smell of decay hidden behind the glamorous facade of Parisian boulevards and London shipyards, a moral decay that you recorded bitterly in winter notes on summer impressions. You realize that Europe's material development is only a shell covering spiritual emptiness, and Russia should not follow that suicidal path, a prophetic warning you want to scream for the whole world to hear. But fate once again strikes you with blows of hatred when Vremya magazine is permanently closed in May 1863 due to a misunderstanding by censors regarding the uprising in Poland. In just a moment, your financial foundation and only voice are stripped away by a dry administrative order, pushing you and Mikhail into a desperate situation. To escape reality and seek an outlet for your tormented soul, you undertake a second European trip. But this time, you do not go alone in thought. You are caught in an emotional whirlwind with Apollinaria Suslova, also known as Polina. Polina, a young girl 20 years your junior, carries within her a cruelty, selfishness, and a desire for freedom to the point of destruction. When you arrive in Paris to find her, you discover your heart has been trampled upon when she admits her feelings for another medical student. Frantic jealousy and wounded self-esteem led you to describe her as a great egoist. Her egoism and her vanity are colossal. She demands everything of other people, all the perfections, and does not pardon the slightest imperfection in the light of other qualities that one may possess. Despite the humiliation, you still admit your pathetic dependence on her, a love both painful and impossible to break. I still love her, but I do not want to love her anymore. She doesn't deserve this love. In despair over broken love and the pressure of debt, you seek out the casinos of Wiesbaden and Baden-Baden as a way to challenge destiny. The sound of the roulette ball rolling on the spinning disc, the clinking of chips, and the dim yellow light of the casino awakened the demon of addiction within you. You are fascinated by the thought that you could use mathematical reason to master chance, to win a huge sum, and save your career. But the reality is white nights sitting at the gambling table, where you lose everything from the last ruble to your coat and Maria's jewelry. The extreme euphoria when winning and the horrific emptiness when losing everything created a cycle of self-destruction lasting nearly a decade. You write countless desperate letters to friends to borrow money for hotel bills, feeling like a sinner being crushed by your own irrational desires. Gambling is no longer a game. It is a direct confrontation with nothingness, where you realize that humans sometimes intentionally choose collapse just to feel the power of free will. The year 1864 arrives like an endless funeral, as your most loved ones leave you one by one. In April, your wife, Maria Dmitrievna, breathes her last after years of being tormented by tuberculosis. You sit by the sickbed, listening to her weak, dry cough, blending with the cold of St. Petersburg, feeling an infinite sorrow for a marriage full of unhappiness, yet carrying a strange bond of pain. Because of her strange, suspicious, and fantastic character, we were definitely not happy together, but we could not stop loving each other, and the more unhappy we were, the more attached to each other we became. Her departure leaves a vast silence, but the tragedy does not stop there. Only 3 months later, your beloved brother, Mikhail, your only confidant, also suddenly passes away from liver disease. Mikhail's death is a direct blow to your soul, for he was not just a brother but an indispensable part of your creative and business world. You stand alone amidst the ruins of the newly founded Epocha magazine, facing the departure of close friends like Apollon Grigoriev, feeling death surrounding you from all sides. The financial burden Mikhail left behind is a massive figure, a mountain of debt from printers and creditors that could push anyone into prison. Although not legally required, with proud self-esteem and the honor of a man, you decide to voluntarily shoulder that entire debt on your thin shoulders. You become the sole pillar, providing for Mikhail's widow, the young grandchildren, and also Maria's stepson. You live in a dilapidated apartment, eat frugal meals, and work under the constant threat of creditors, feeling yourself backed into a corner of existence. It is from the very depths of that suffering and solitude that the indignant scream of a repressed soul echoes through the masterpiece notes from underground. You write as if spinning silk from your own gut, turning physical and mental pain into naked, provocative lines about a sick and spiteful man. I am a sick man. I am a spiteful man. Your underground man is the embodiment of everything you loathe about Western rationalism and utilitarianism. You use this character to counterattack the ideas that humans are beings based entirely on interest and the mathematical logic of 2 + 2 = 4. You argue that humans contain deep, irrational urges, ready to break all perfect social orders, even that brilliant crystal palace, just to prove they are not a piano key determined by natural laws. You ultimately affirm that what humans desire most is independent choice. What man wants is simply independent choice, whatever that independence may cost and wherever it may lead. This work is not just a novel, it is a philosophical manifesto on freedom, faith, and the dark complexity of the soul. A prophetic warning that if the world is built only by dry reason, it will collapse under the weight of suppressed desires for freedom. You finish writing the last lines when the candle has run out, and the pale dawn is creeping through the filthy window, feeling a painful relief as if you have just performed spiritual surgery on yourself. You leave your writing desk, eyes weary from lack of sleep, staring at the ink-stained manuscripts. You slowly stand up, feeling the exhaustion in your joints as you walk toward the worn coat hanging on the wall. The sound of a train whistle from afar echoes in the stillness of early morning St. Petersburg, reminding you of unfinished journeys and debts still waiting. You take a deep breath of the room's musty air, then decisively open the door to step out into the dark hallway, where the footsteps of creditors seem to have already begun echoing at the bottom of the stairs. The smell of old, dust-laden pages and the moisture from the Neva River seem to thicken in the cramped attic in St. Petersburg during the summer of 1865. You stand there, amidst piles of unfinished manuscripts and a barrage of debt letters, feeling as if you were being suffocated by the very burdens you voluntarily took upon your shoulders after the deaths of Mikhail and Maria. The massive debt from the magazine Times, Epoch Times is like a 1,000-pound stone weighing on every breath, and the responsibility of supporting your late brother's family and your wife's stepson has pushed you into a state of total physical and mental exhaustion. You decide to flee to Wiesbaden, Germany, carrying a thin hope of a miracle at the casino, but instead of salvation, you fall into a vortex of losing everything. You stand before the gambling table, watching your last rubles evaporate with the indifferent spin of the small ball, then trudge back to your hotel room, pawning your personal watch just to afford a meager meal. It is in the depths of that humiliation and destitution, in a cold room where you were denied even breakfast for unpaid bills, that an idea of a crime began to take shape in your mind. You pick up your pen writing a letter to the editor of Times, the Russian messenger Times, with all the urgency of a soul standing on the edge. "Can I hope to publish my story in your magazine, Russian messenger?" This is a psychological account of one crime. You begin to dissect the soul of Rodion Raskolnikov, a poor student living in a room like a coffin in St. Petersburg, who used an axe to test a horrific theory. You go deep into the labyrinth of his thoughts, where the boundary between justice and crime is blurred by a cold, rational logic. Your Raskolnikov does not kill for money, but to prove he belongs to the class of extraordinary individuals like Napoleon, those who have the right to step over corpses to achieve a great purpose. You feel every frantic heartbeat of the character as the axe swings down, hearing the silent scream in his heart as he realizes that, "I didn't kill a person, I killed a principle." The contrast between the stifling heat, the stench of alcohol and dust in the slums of St. Petersburg, and the cold, paranoid mind of Raskolnikov is described by you with razor-sharp sensory details. You see him wandering in a delirium over the bridges, obsessed by the red of blood and the terrifying silence of conscience. But amidst that darkness, you light the candle of Sonia Marmeladova, a girl who sells her body but carries the soul of a saint. Sonia does not use logic to convince, but uses love and sacrifice to lead Raskolnikov back to Mother Earth, advising him to go at once this very minute and stand at the crossroad. Bow Dow, and first kiss the earth which you have defiled, and say to all men, Aludi, I am a murderer, then God will send you life again. As the first chapters of Times Crime and Punishment Times are published and shock the literary world, you still cannot escape the siege of cruel destiny in the form of the publisher Dostoyevski. The contract you signed in your moment of greatest despair now becomes a noose tightening around your career. You have less than a month to complete an entirely new novel. Otherwise, all rights to your past and future works will fall into the hands of that exploiter for 9 long years. You fall into a state of panic, pacing the room with disheveled hair and eyes red from lack of sleep, feeling the sand of time slipping through your fingers. It is then, on the 4th of October, 1866, that Anna Grigorievna Snitkina enters your life like a saving angel in the storm. The 20-year-old girl with a calm demeanor and a shorthand pen in hand faces you, a 45-year-old man, haggard, unkempt, and full of psychological scars. Her presence brings a new breath of life, a practical order amidst the chaos of your life. You begin to dictate, pacing the room like a caged beast, while Anna records every word with precision and patience. The 2 6-day sprint to write the novel Times, the Gambler Times, is not just a literary effort, but an anatomy of compulsion itself, a precise and unflinching account of how an intelligent mind can observe its own destruction and continue to ward it. You put into the pages the rawest experiences of the ecstasy and pain at the roulette table, of how a sharp intellect can observe its own collapse yet be unable to stop. Anna works selflessly, staying up all night to transcribe the shorthand notes into a complete manuscript, and when the final deadline arrives, it is her intelligence that breaks Dostoyevski's evasion plot by taking the manuscript to the police station for a receipt. This victory not only saves your career, but ignites in your heart a deep affection for this small but resilient girl. You realize you cannot live without her calm and devotion. On November 8th, you borrowed the story of an old painter to propose to Anna, and your heart trembled to hear her respond with a vow to love you forever. I would answer you that I love and will love you all my life. The wedding at Trinity Cathedral in February 1867 seems like a glorious note, but a cruel reality quickly surrounds the newlywed couple. Jealousy and hostility from the parasites in your family turn the home into a battlefield of reproaches and schemes. Anna has to endure the coldness of your stepson, Pasha, and Mikhail's widow, while creditors never stop knocking with arrest warrants hanging over your head. You feel helpless watching your young wife caught up in the troubles you caused in the past. It is at this point that Anna performs an act of extraordinary courage. She pawns all of her most precious dowry, from the piano to fur coats, to get money for both of you to flee to Western Europe. You board the train leaving St. Petersburg in April 1867, leaving behind the curses of creditors and the stifling atmosphere of family, beginning an exile that you initially thought would last a few months, but in reality lasted over 4 long years. The journey through Berlin, Dresden, and then stopping at Baden-Baden is a series of days torn between creative genius and the darkness of addiction. The sound of the roulette ball rolling on the disc in Baden-Baden once again fascinates your mind, causing you to fall into the most horrific gambling deliriums. You rush to the casino with a meager advance, only to lose every penny, having to pawn even the wedding rings of the two of you, and even Anna's winter clothes. You return to the room in a state of total breakdown, kneeling at your wife's feet, weeping and begging for forgiveness like a child who has done wrong. Continuous epileptic seizures hit after every loss, leaving you with a shattered body and a mind submerged in the fog of humiliation. But instead of blaming or leaving you, Anna becomes the only peaceful harbor, a patient financial manager, and a companion whose tolerance is almost saintly. She records every cent, endures hunger and cold with you, and keeps you from falling into the abyss of madness. It is precisely this unconditional tolerance from Anna that creates a safe spiritual space, allowing you to begin gestating the next great thoughts, even as your heart still bleeds from self-hatred. You sit quietly by the window of a cheap rented room in Geneva, watching the autumn rain cling to the glass and listening to Anna's steady breathing as she falls asleep from exhaustion. Unfinished manuscript pages lie scattered on the table, covered by the shadows of the European twilight slowly descending. You slowly stand up, gently covering your wife with a thin blanket, then walk toward the corner of the room where the suitcase still lies open like a reminder of a life in exile. The wind whistling through the cracks of the door carries the cold from the distant Alps, urging you to prepare for a new move, taking your small family deeper into the heart of the old continent, amidst the storms of destiny waiting ahead. The cold of the Lake Geneva region creeps through your thin, worn-out cloak, carrying the smell of frozen water and the ultimate solitude of an exile. You stand by the window of a cramped rented room, looking at the majestic Alps covered in white snow, but in your heart, you feel only an unquenchable longing for the dusty streets of St. Petersburg. In April 1867, you were forced to flee your homeland, to escape the ghosts of creditors, taking your young wife Anna into an exile you initially thought would be a short trip. But now, 1868 has knocked on the door, and that trip has turned into a journey of displacement with no set return date, taking you through Geneva, Vevey, Milan, and then Florence amidst surrounding destitution. You look out at Europe, the world that the Russian intelligentsia always revered, and feel a deep contempt rising in your veins. To you, so-called Western civilization is but a magnificent cemetery, where capitalism and the worship of materialism are gnawing at the human soul like moths. You recall the Crystal Palace in London and shiver as you realize it is a monument to soulless modern society, the myth of progress, and the worship of empty materialism. The most cruel shadow is still the gambling demon reigning in your mind, a roulette addiction worse than ever that turned exile into a series of humiliating days. At the casinos in Baden-Baden or Dresden, you burned through the meager royalties just received from the magazine Times, the Russian messenger Times, in a few short hours. The sound of the roulette ball rolling on the wooden disc is like the mocking laughter of destiny, and each time you lose, it is a time you fall into the deep pit of self-contempt. You look at Anna, your patient, young wife, who had to quietly remove her wedding ring, precious earrings, and even her last personal items to take to the pawn shop for a few silver coins to buy food and pay for the room. After every white night at the casino, you return to the room in a state of extreme torment, kneeling at Anna's feet and weeping, swearing never to repeat the offense. But then that demon soon awakens and drags you back into the vortex of self-destruction. You feel like a sinner torn between the aspirations of a creative genius and the weakness of an uncontrollable ego, where every hand is a bet on both honor and the lives of your loved ones. During this journey of suffering, an aesthetic shock at the Basel Art Museum shook the entire foundation of your faith. You stood frozen before the painting Times, The Body of the Dead, Christ in the Tomb Times, by Hans Holbein, feeling a cold current run down your spine. It was not the image of a divine Christ with a brilliant aura, but a mortal corpse in the process of decay, with gray skin and wounds swollen from physical death. Anna had to frantically pull you away when she saw your face distorted with fear, exactly like the moment just before an epileptic seizure ravages the brain. That painting posed a harrowing question. How can humans believe in the resurrection if Christ himself could not overcome the laws of natural decay? You realize that if the sacrifice on the cross was quite meaningless against physical death, then all faith becomes void. This shock did not make you lose faith, but it forced you to face the nakedness of existence, turning belief into an arduous battle between the light of resurrection and the darkness of destruction that you would later bring directly into the philosophical debates of your works. Personal tragedy struck again, as if to test the final endurance of a soul already full of scars. On the 5th of March 1868, in Geneva, your first daughter, Sophia, also known as Sonia, was born in supreme happiness and a tenderness you had never felt. You held that tiny being in your arms, feeling as if all your sins and debts were washed away by the child's sweet breath. But that paradise lasted exactly 3 months, when pneumonia took baby Sonia amidst the cold of the Swiss spring. You looked at your daughter's cold body, wept and sobbed like a woman in despair, standing and kissing her small face for hours in unquenchable regret. Why would God let an innocent child suffer and depart so early? That question carved a permanent hole in your soul, sowing seeds of doubt about worldly justice that the character Ivan Karamazov would later use to question God. You left Geneva in violent pain, wandering through Vevey and Milan to escape the memories of your lost child, until light returned in September 1869, when baby Lubov was born in Dresden, giving you a thin hope to continue living and writing. It was amidst those years of destitution, mourning, and debilitating seizures that you gestated and completed one of your greatest masterpieces, the novel Times, The Idiot. You set for yourself a mad literary ambition to depict a completely beautiful person amidst a world full of corruption. You created Prince Myshkin, an embodiment of Christ on earth, who carries within him immense compassion and saintly innocence. You bravely gave Myshkin your own epilepsy, describing those strange moments of ecstatic elevation right before the seizure hits, like a divine revelation. You wrote this book in chaos, dictating to Anna between seizures and gambling binges. Your Myshkin enters saint. Petersburg high society with absolute honesty. But in the end, he is destroyed by that very honesty. For the world cannot tolerate a goodness they cannot control or comprehend. When you completed the work in Florence, you called it a beautiful failure. But deep down, you knew you had touched a painful truth about the fragility of goodness in the secular world. At the end of 1869, shocking news from home threw you into a new ideological fury. The murder of student Ivanov by Sergei Nikeyev's revolutionary group. You were horrified to realize that revolutionary will, when separated from morality and faith, inevitably leads to the most brutal violence. This was the catalyst for you to begin writing Time's Demons, a sharp political and psychological indictment against the nihilism spreading among Russian youth. Through the character Fyodor Verkovensky, you pointed out that a movement built on the premise that the end justifies the means would find that the means become the end. You saw in Russia's future a new dictatorship built on the ashes of individual conscience, where God is removed and humans become slaves to alien ideologies. The novel is your scream of warning, an effort to exorcise the demons haunting the nation's soul, even as you had to fight the demons in your own home. The final battle with your roulette addiction took place in April 1871 inches, Wiesbaden, in a moment where you touched the deepest bottom of shame. After losing the last of the family's money, you returned to the room and knelt before Anna, crying like an abandoned child. But in that very moment of despair, a miraculous change occurred. You declared that the compulsion had left him. You swore before God and your wife that this was the last bet. And with extraordinary character, you kept that promise until your very last breath. Perhaps the fact that you mistakenly entered a synagogue when intending to go to the casino was a spiritual omen that woke you up. Or simply Anna's tolerant love had triumphed over the darkness in your heart. This liberation was like a second resurrection, allowing you to focus all your remaining energy on preparing for the return to Russia after more than 4 years of wandering. On the 8th of July, 1871, you officially set foot back in St. Petersburg, bringing with you a small family and precious manuscripts that had been refined through red fire and white snow. To ensure the safety of your writings before customs inspections, you personally burned many drafts of Times, the idiot Times on the train through Berlin, a painful sacrifice to protect the future. This return was no longer a flight, but an affirmation of the status of a great writer who had been tempered through the most horrific tragedies. Anna, with her brilliant financial management talent, began to settle with creditors and personally manage the publication of books for her husband, freeing you from the burden of daily bread so you could focus on your greatest writings. You look at your newborn son, Fyodor. Look at the St. Petersburg streets sinking into the twilight and feel a strange peace spreading. The dark days of exile have closed, but the great ideas you bring back will soon become a beacon for the entire world of literature in the brilliant decade ahead. You slowly walk toward the baby's cradle, hearing the child's gentle breathing blending with the sound of church bells echoing from afar. You reach up to stroke the back of your neck, feeling the wrinkles of time and the scars of epileptic seizures still there. But your eyes now burn with a firmer faith than ever. You take a deep breath of the smell of ink and the familiar St. Petersburg air, then quietly go to your desk, where white sheets of paper are waiting to be filled with reflections on the brothers Karamazov. The steam whistle tears through the thin mist of a July morning in 1871, carrying the stifling heat of a St. Petersburg summer as you step onto the platform after 4 long years of exile. You take a deep breath of the characteristic air of your homeland, the smell of dust, kerosene, and the simmering scent of political unrest. You are no longer the timid debtor of 4 years ago. You return as a man who has tasted every degree of misery, carrying a treasure of thoughts refined through white nights in Dresden and Florence. However, this return is far from peaceful, as St. Petersburg is then shaken by the aftershocks of the murder of student Ivan Ivanov by Sergei Neshayev's revolutionary group. You see in that tragedy not just a criminal offense, but the manifestation of the demons of atheistic rationalism gradually possessing the soul of the Russian youth. You plunge into completing Times, Demons Times, as if performing a literary exorcism, using your pen to expose the brutality of those who believe that a movement built on the premise that the end justifies the means would find that the means become the end. You borrow the image of the swine rushing into the sea from the Gospel of Luke as a metaphor for the nation's destiny. And the demons went out and went into the herd of swine. And behold, the whole herd of swine rushed down the steep bank into the sea and perished in the water. In the workspace of your new apartment, you construct a complex system of characters where each person represents a dark fragment of the extreme thinking gnawing at society. You embody Fyodor Verkovensky, the ruthless and emotionless manipulator, or Kirillo, the philosopher, who pursues the logical endpoint of atheism to its most terrifying conclusion that if God does not exist, then man himself must become God, and the ultimate act of freedom is the assertion of absolute will through self-destruction. You also do not forget to depict the idealistic, Western-influenced generation of the 1840s, epitomized in the character of Stepan Verkovensky, who is presented as the unconscious progenitors and helpless accomplices of the demonic forces that take possession of the town. Each manuscript page written is a fierce ideological battle, where you warn of a future where leaving boundless freedom, I conclude with boundless desperation. This work is not just a novel, it is a prophetic vision of the tragedies Russia would suffer in the following century if it continued to abandon faith to chase the illusions of atheistic socialism. Amidst these ideological storms, Anna Grigorievna once again appears as a guardian angel, not only spiritually, but also materially. You look with amazement at your young wife, who has transformed from a shy shorthand writer into a financial manager more decisive and sharp than anyone. Anna realizes you have been exploited by publishers for too long, and in 1873, she makes a bold decision: the establishment of the Dostoyevski Publishing Company. You witness your apartment turning into a small bookstore, where Anna directly negotiates with printers, manages every ruble, and personally sells each copy of Times Demons Times to readers who come to the door. This initiative brings an extraordinary financial turning point, helping you for the first time in your life to hold the full profit from your work and step by step completely erase the ghost of debt that has haunted you for 10 long years. You feel a strange relief as the debt letters thin out, replaced by profit statements and the stability you have long craved for your small family. Your glory continues to spread as you venture into journalism, beginning as the editor for the conservative newspaper Times, the Citizen Times in early 1873. However, the constraints of editorial work and strict government censorship make you feel stifled. You have to appear in court twice for minor printing violations, which urges you to resign to pursue a greater personal project, a writer's diary. Starting in 1876, this independent publication became an unprecedented cultural phenomenon, a fascinating blend of personal essays, literary criticism, social commentary, U.S. and political prophecy. Through each monthly issue, you become a spiritual guide for an entire generation, receiving thousands of letters from all walks of life, from students who wrote to ask his opinion on questions of ethics and faith. Mothers wrote about their children. Provincial magistrates sought his views on specific legal cases. You are no longer just a novelist. This unique publication truly turned him into a household name throughout Russia, especially among students and young people who devoured his insights. Your fame reaches the palace as Tsar Alexander II invites you to meet and requests that you act as a spiritual tutor for the princes. You use this influence to promote Pan-Slavism, viewing the Russo-Turkish War as a moral crusade to liberate Orthodox brothers from foreign yokes. Parallel to these resounding successes is the gradual decline of your physical body under the weight of epilepsy and emphysema, causing constant shortness of breath. From 1874 to 1879, you have to make 4 trips to the Bad Ems resort in Germany for treatment as advised by doctors, who warn that your life is now measured in years. Between exhausting treatments, you never stop creating, completing Times, the adolescent Times, in 1875 for the magazine Times, Notes of the Fatherland Times, with record-high royalties. In this work, you dissect the decay of family foundations in contemporary Russian society through the character Arkady Dolgoruki and his Rothschild idea, a modified idea of Pushkin's miserly knight. You contrast that youthful ambition with the primitive beauty and pure faith of the pilgrim Makar Ivanov, continuing to pursue one of the images of a positively beautiful person, akin to the image of Bishop Tikhon that you began during Mishkin's time. Though your health weakens, your mind still burns with ideas of salvation through the love and humility of simple souls. But the most cruel tragedy chooses the peak of your glory to strike a fatal blow. In May 1878, your youngest son, Alexei, whom you affectionately called Alyosha, passed away after a violent seizure at just 3 years old. The departure of that innocent child throws you into a deep pit of despair and ultimate guilt. For a father who himself suffered from the very same illness, this must have been absolutely devastating, a cruel echo of his own suffering and fears. You kneel by your son's cold body, heart shattered by the injustice of fate, and questions about the suffering of children once again besiege your mind. Anna, in an effort to save her husband's collapsing soul, enlists the young philosopher Vladimir Solovyov to take you to the Optina Pustin monastery that spring. There, the meeting with Elder Ambrose, a living saint of orthodoxy, brings you miraculous comfort. The elder's teachings and the monastery's stillness help you transform the pain of losing a child into the greatest inspiration to build the characters of Elder Zosima and the youngest son, Alyosha, in your final masterpiece. You realize that though death may take the body, love and sacrifice will always be the fire that warms this world. By the end of 1878, though your body still bleeds from pain, you proudly accept the title of corresponding member of the Russian Academy of Sciences, a supreme recognition of your cultural contributions. You sit again at Staraya Russa in the quiet small house, looking out at the garden where Alyosha once ran, feeling an intense urge to complete times the brothers Karamazov. You know your time is short, and this novel will be the final spiritual testament you leave for Russia and all of humanity. Every experience, from childhood at the hospital, the pain of the Siberian dungeon, the madness at the casino, and the tears at your son's grave, are converging on the white pages. You feel the pulse of a masterpiece about to take shape. A story of three brothers representing the flesh, the intellect, and the soul, waiting to be liberated through your pen. You slowly stand up from your desk, letting out a dry cough and feeling your chest tighten from emphysema. You walk toward the window, watching the darkness gradually cover the roofs of Staraya Russa, where the night stars begin to glisten like the eyes of the children who are gone. You take a deep breath of the fresh countryside air, then decisively pick up your wooden cane, stepping out the door to begin a short walk under the moonlight, letting your mind be still before entering the final journey of creation. The scratching of the pen on the paper blends with the faint whistling from your chest every time you try to breathe deeply, creating a mournful music in the silence of late night at Staraya Russa. You feel the weight of time pressing down on your thin shoulders, where emphysema begins to tighten its grip on your lungs, making every word written carry the labor of a life that is gradually being exhausted. The seizures from the Siberian era have not let go of you. On the contrary, they return with a more devastating intensity, throwing you into the darkness of confusion and leaving a feeling of decay that lasts for many days afterward. Physicians at EMS in August 1879 looked at you with apprehension, diagnosing that your lungs were ravaged and incurable, but you know that death cannot touch you before the final epic is completed. You sit there, under the dim yellow oil lamp, feeling the cold of the dark night surrounding you, but your heart burns with a creative fire more intense than ever. You write not just with ink, but with the very last drops of blood from a soul that has passed through hell, leaving on paper reflections that the whole world will later bow to in reverence. The pain of losing your little son Alyosha in May 1878 remains a bleeding wound, a simmering torment as you realize the child carried the hereditary epilepsy from yourself. You look at the empty cradle, remembering his innocent eyes and warmth, and suddenly realize that the child's departure is the most powerful spiritual call in your life. You do not let that pain drown you in despair, but have transformed it into the image of Alyosha Karamazov, an angel on earth, one who carries a pure heart and unshakable faith. Your Alyosha is not just a character, he is the hope, the salvation, and the resurrection of the very son lost in the mind of the suffering old father. You realize that, in this universe full of injustice, only the unconditional love of saintly souls can be the most satisfactory answer to the existence of pain. Every line written about Alyosha is a gentle kiss you send into eternity, where your child is waiting. And that is also when you began to build the grand structure of times the brothers Karamazov. You lead the reader into the labyrinth of the Karamazov family, a microcosm of Russia, standing on the threshold of moral collapse and violent upheaval. You create old Fyodor Pavlovich, a lecherous and immoral man, only to place him alongside his 4 sons, 4 fragments of your own soul and of humanity. There is Dmitri, passionate with uncontrollable carnal desires, Ivan, with cold logic and devastating atheism, Alyosha, of faith, and Smerdyakov, the illegitimate son, carrying within him all the darkest corners of evil. You clearly feel the tension between these characters, for that is the battle taking place within your own chest, the battle between flesh, intellect, and soul. The parricide in the novel is not just a criminal offense, it is the collapse of family and social order in the absence of genuine love and faith. You write about Ivan's paranoia, Dmitri's torment, and Alyosha's stillness, feeling every pulse of the great ideas colliding in the most tragic and magnificent artistic space you have ever created. The climax of that struggle lies in the chapter The Grand Inquisitor, where you gave the character Ivan the sharpest arguments to question the existence of God. You feel the chill in Ivan's voice as he refuses to accept a world where eternal harmony is built on the tears of innocent children. It is not God that I do not accept, Alyosha. I only most respectfully return the ticket to him. You transformed into the 90-year-old Grand Inquisitor in Seville, standing before the silent Jesus, to accuse him of bringing humans the most terrible burden, the freedom of choice. You write of a church that has stripped away that freedom in exchange for bread and security, because humans are inherently too weak to carry the responsibility for their own souls. But then, you let Jesus answer. He suddenly approached the old man and kissed him gently on his bloodless age of lips. That kiss is your answer to all dry philosophies, an affirmation that love and tolerance are always greater than any mathematical logic or formulas of earthly justice. The consequence of the nihilism Ivan pursues leads to the collapse of his mind as he realizes that the theory, without God and immortal life, all things are lawful, prompted Smerdyakov's hand to commit the parricide. You see Ivan's madness as a warning to all of Russia of an atheistic future where humans turn themselves into God only to finally find destruction opposite that darkness. You present the teachings of Elder Zosima about love in action. Love in action is a harsh and dreadful thing compared to love in dreams. You write the final lines of Times the Brothers Karamazov times in a state of ecstasy, feeling as if you have just completed a spiritual testament for humanity. Although you once intended this as only the introduction to a more massive project about the life of a great sinner, deep down, you know you have said everything that needs to be said, touching the very ends of light and darkness in the human soul. June 1880, you stand before the Alexander Pushkin Monument in Moscow, feeling the vibration of an entire nation turning toward you. You look down at the auditorium filled with people who once hated each other, both Slavophiles and Westernizers, all now holding their breath waiting for your words. As you speak in praise of Pushkin as a symbol of the universal empathetic capacity of the Russian soul, your voice rises with the power of a prophet. You call for reconciliation and global brotherhood, declaring Russia's mission in reconciling the contradictions of humanity. At that moment, the entire hall fell into a state of intense agitation. Lifelong rivals like Turgenev stepped forward to embrace you in tears. When I proclaimed at the end about the universal unity of people, the hall was in hysterics. You feel you are no longer an individual, but the voice of the nation's soul. the bridge between past and future. That supreme glory is the last magnificent note in your life, full of humiliation and suffering, a supreme recognition for all you have sacrificed for art and faith. Entering 1881, your breath becomes shorter and more fragmented than ever under the pressure of pulmonary hemorrhages. You lie on the old fabric-covered bed in the St. Petersburg apartment, listening to the church bells echoing from afar and feeling the cold of death spreading from your feet. When the secret police come to search the apartment next door, the psychological shock causes the blood vessels in your lungs to burst, signaling the final moment has arrived. You ask Anna to read to you the parable of the prodigal son from the old Bible that accompanied you through 4 years of hard labor in Siberia. You close your eyes, listening to every word of forgiveness and return, feeling your soul preparing for a journey further than any European road or Asian steppe. You borrow the words of the Bible to tell Anna, "But John forbade him, saying, I have a need to be baptized of thee, and comest thou to me? And Jesus answering said unto him, Suffer it to be so now, for thus it becometh us to fulfill all righteousness. Here now, permit it, do not restrain me." In the final hours of lucidity, you turn to look at the woman who has accompanied you through burning casinos and destitute white nights. You take Anna's hand, using your last strength to whisper the tenderest words. "Remember, Anya, I have always loved you passionately and have never been unfaithful to you ever, even in my thoughts." You take your last breath at 8:38 p.m. on the 9th of February 1881, leaving a vast silence in the small room and an infinite grief for all of Russia. Your death is not an ending, but the completion of a great destiny. The final grain of wheat has fallen into the ground to sprout into countless thoughts for future generations. Tens of thousands of people poured into the streets of St. Petersburg to see you off, a funeral procession miles long, consisting of all classes, from passionate students to the most destitute whom you always loved. You lie in a simple wooden coffin, buried at Tikhvin Cemetery, where on the gravestone is carved the quote from the Gospel of John. "Verily, verily, I say unto you, except a corn of wheat fall into the ground and die, it abideth alone. But if it dies, it bringeth forth much fruit." Late-season snowflakes fall gently onto the grave, covering the name Fyodor Mikhailovich Dostoyevski, but unable to hide the light from the masterpieces you left for the world. You have gone into eternal sleep, taking with you the secret of the human soul, but the echoes from the debates on faith, freedom, and love in your works will endure with time. You feel a strange lightness as the soul separates from the decaying body, floating lazily over the towering roofs of St. Petersburg, sinking in deep purple twilight. You fly over the freezing Neva River, past the stone walls of the Peter and Paul fortress, then toward the vast Siberian steppe where shackles once bound your flesh. All pain, every seizure, and every destitution vanish, making way for an absolute stillness and a gentle stream of light beckoning from the distant horizon. You smile, feeling the warmth of the kiss from Jesus that you once wrote about in the story. Then slowly step into that mystical light, where loved ones and lost children are standing waiting for you with open arms. The oil lamp in the small room in St. Petersburg is fading, leaving only a tiny, flickering speck of light on the wooden table like a final star before the dawn of eternity. You feel an absolute sense of relief spreading through your body, like a grain of wheat that has fulfilled its mission, quietly falling into the warm earth to await the day it sprouts into lush green fields. The journey through the Siberian dungeons, the fiery casinos, and the tear-stained manuscript pages has now receded into the distance, leaving only the vast stillness of a soul that has found its final reconciliation with God and humanity. You look out the window, where pure white snowflakes are still falling steadily upon the Tikvin cemetery, covering the gravestone of the man named Dostoyevski with a soft and pristine silk-like layer. The questions about the suffering of children, about freedom and faith that he spent his entire life grappling with, have now found their answers in the sacred silence of the night. The world outside may still be moving with constant upheavals, but here, in the space of profound contemplation, you have found a peaceful harbor for your soul. Let the great thoughts of Dostoyevsky become a soothing lullaby, leading you into a deep and dreamless sleep where all the burdens of reality are cast away. Your breath has now become lighter and steadier than ever before, synchronizing with the stillness of all things, sinking into a deep slumber. Thank you for accompanying me through these 10 chapters of a life that was stormy yet incredibly brilliant. May you have beautiful dreams, where the light of love and compassion always illuminates every path of the soul. Sleep well, now that the grain of wheat rests in the good soil, and the dawn of a new day will bring new hopes.